Moscow, 1882. In a mansion on Bolshaya Alexeyevskaya Street, one of the wealthiest men in the Russian Empire is dying. Abram Abramovich Morozov, textile king, owner of the Tver manufactory, a man whose fortune was estimated at tens of millions of rubles, takes his last breath. At his bedside stands a 34-year-old woman dressed in black. This is Varvara Alexeyevna Morozova, née Koludova. She does not yet know that within hours she will face a choice that will define the rest of her life. A choice between freedom and empire, between heart and duty, between the right to be a woman and the obligation to become an iron leader. In the merchant class Moscow of the 1880s, a woman without a husband was nobody, especially a young widow with 4 children. The merchant world lived by its own brutal laws, where a woman's role was to be a silent shadow behind her husband. But Varvara Morozova would become the exception to every rule. She would take control of a textile empire worth 20 million rubles, roughly equivalent to $500 million today, manage factories employing over 10,000 workers, and transform the family business into one of the largest industrial enterprises in the empire. How did she do it? The answer lies in a document unsealed on the 3rd day after Abram Morozov's funeral. The deceased industrialist's will sent shockwaves through Moscow's elite. Abram Morozov, a man of the old school, an old believer to his core, had devised a cunning scheme. He left his wife full control over all the factories, capital, and real estate. Varvara became the sole mistress of the Morozov Empire. But there was one condition written in the iron letters of legal language. If Varvara Alexeyevna were to remarry, she would instantly lose all rights to management. The factories would pass to a board of trustees, and she would receive only a modest allowance. The dead husband had reached from beyond the grave and locked his wife in a golden cage. Consider the situation. A young woman, barely 34, receives colossal power and wealth. The Tver manufactory, the Nikolskaya manufactory in Vladimir province, warehouses in Moscow, mansions, millions in bank accounts, but the price of this wealth was eternal widowhood. In a society where remarriage for a widow was normal and even expected, Varvara had to renounce any possibility of personal happiness. This was not merely a legal document, it was a sentence of lifelong solitude. Why did Abram Morozov take such a step? The answer lies in the peculiarities of merchant class thinking of that era. The Morozovs were old believers, members of a traditionalist Russian Orthodox sect that had split from the official church in the 17th century. For them, the family business was sacred. Abram was terrified that a new husband might squander the wealth accumulated over generations, or worse, absorb the Morozov factories into his own holdings. He trusted no one except the mother of his children, yet he could not imagine that a woman might live her entire life alone. It was a calculation, both cynical and naive. Varvara stood in her late husband's study as the notary read the terms of the will. Around her gathered relatives, factory managers, and attorneys. Everyone waited for her decision. Would she refuse management in favor of freedom, or accept the terms and become a prisoner of her own wealth? Tension hung in the air. Many of the men present secretly hoped the young widow would be frightened by the responsibility. Then they could create a board of trustees and carve up the Morozov empire piece by piece. But Varvara Alexeyevna surprised them all. She calmly listened to the terms, nodded, and in a firm voice declared that she accepted all conditions set by her late husband. She would manage the factories. She would preserve the empire for her children. She was prepared to pay any price. In that moment, a new player appeared in Moscow's business world. A woman who dared to challenge every written and unwritten law of the merchant class. Her decision sent shockwaves through Moscow's business circles. A woman at the head of an industrial empire, it was unheard of. Old believer merchants, accustomed to dealing exclusively with men, could not believe they would now have to discuss contracts and prices with a lady in morning dress. On the stock exchange, they whispered that Morozova would last a year at most before going bankrupt or running off to marry the first man who asked. Bets were placed on how quickly the Morozov empire would collapse under female management. But the skeptics did not know one crucial fact. Varvara Morozova was not simply a merchant's daughter raised for marriage and housekeeping. Behind her stood an extraordinary family history. She was the daughter of Alexei Ivanovich Kludov, a man who had built his own textile empire with an iron hand and ruthless will. The Kludovs were a dynasty where cruelty combined with genius, where despotism walked hand in hand with enlightenment. And Varvara had absorbed these qualities from birth. To understand the iron will of Varvara Morozova, one must look inside house number 17 on Pokrovka Street, where in 1848 a girl was born who would change the history of Russian philanthropy. The Kludov family was a unique phenomenon, even by the standards of eccentric merchant Moscow. They combined the incompatible, fanatical devotion to the old belief and a passion for European enlightenment, Eastern-style despotism and a love of fine arts, ruthlessness in business and generosity in patronage. Her father, Alexei Ivanovich Kludov, was an almost mythical figure. Contemporaries described him as a man of incredible contradictions. He could pray for hours according to old believer rites, then lock himself in his library with French philosophers. He could fire a manager over a penny discrepancy and immediately donate 100,000 rubles to build a hospital. His textile empire in Yegorevsk ran like clockwork, generating millions in profit. But Alexei Kludov's true passion was books. He assembled one of the finest private libraries in Russia, where ancient manuscripts sat alongside the latest European publications. The atmosphere in the Kludov household was one of despotism elevated to a family philosophy. Alexei Ivanovich demanded absolute obedience from his children. The daily schedule was planned to the minute. Rise at 5 a.m., prayers, lessons with tutors, lunch in complete silence, more lessons, evening prayers. Any deviation was punished immediately and harshly. Yet the education the Kludov children received was brilliant. French, German, and English, history, literature, mathematics, natural sciences. The best teachers in Moscow came to the house on Pokrovka. Varvara was the third child. From early childhood, she stood out among her siblings with a particular seriousness and thoughtfulness. While other children ran off to play at the first opportunity, she spent hours in her father's library immersed in books. Alexei Ivanovich, for all his severity, singled Varvara out. He saw something special in her, an inner strength that reminded him of himself. Sometimes he took his daughter to the factory in Yegorevsk, showed her how the looms worked, how accounts were kept, how workers were managed. But Varvara's childhood could not be called happy. The Kludov house was full of dark secrets and family tragedies. Her elder brother, Gerasim, suffered from severe mental illness. His fits of rage terrorized the entire family. Her younger brother, Mikhail, showed peculiarities from childhood that over the years grew into genuine madness. Her sister Alexandra attempted suicide over an unhappy love affair. In this atmosphere of constant tension and fear, Varvara learned the most important lesson: how to survive and maintain composure in any situation. The death of her mother, when Varvara was just 14, was an especially severe trial. Praskovia Ivanovna Kludova had been the only person in the house capable of softening her husband's despotism. After her death, Alexei Ivanovich seemed to lose all restraint. He forbade the children from crying at the funeral, declaring that tears were a sign of weakness. Varvara stood at her mother's coffin with dry eyes, fists clenched until they ached. That moment became a turning point. She understood that in this world one could rely only on oneself. Alexei Kludov prepared his daughters for marriage according to his own understanding. He believed a merchant's wife should be educated but obedient, intelligent but submissive. Varvara was taught to manage a great household, direct servants, and understand accounts. But simultaneously, her father instilled in her an idea that was revolutionary for the time. A woman is capable of more than simply being a shadow of her husband. He told her about European businesswomen, about women rulers, about how intellect has no gender. The paradox was that Alexei Ivanovich, without realizing it, was raising not a submissive merchant's wife, but a future leader. The constant pressure tempered Varvara's character like steel. The necessity of hiding emotions taught her perfect self-control. Observing her father's management methods gave her an understanding of the psychology of power. And her brilliant education opened horizons inaccessible to most women of that era. When Varvara turned 18, Alexei Kludov began searching for a groom. The criteria was simple: old believer, wealthy, from a good family. His daughter's feelings were not taken into account. The choice fell on Abramovich Morozov, heir to a textile empire, a man 15 years Varvara's senior. It was the perfect dynastic marriage, the union of two of Moscow's greatest merchant families. Kludov millions joined with Morozov factories. Varvara accepted her father's decision without objection. She understood this was her fate, but deep down, she already knew she would not be merely a submissive wife. The years spent in the house on Pokrovka had taught her the most important lesson. Power belongs to those capable of holding it. And when her hour came, she would be ready. The wedding of Varvara Kludova and Abram Morozov in 1866 was the event of the year in merchant Moscow. Two of the wealthiest clans united in an alliance that promised to create an industrial empire of unprecedented scale. The ceremony took place in an old believer prayer house, away from the eyes of official authorities. Old believer marriages existed in a legal gray zone in Imperial Russia. The 18-year-old bride, in a heavy brocade dress, stood beside her 33-year-old groom, a man she had seen only a few times before the wedding. This was a marriage as transaction, a marriage as contract, where love did not figure even in the footnotes. Abramovich Morozov made the impression of a solid, reliable man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a full beard and perceptive eyes. He embodied the image of a successful old believer merchant. His Tver manufactory was considered a model enterprise, employing over 5,000 people. Morozov was known as devout yet progressive, the first Moscow factory owner to install English steam engines, who brought in specialists from Manchester and built barracks for workers instead of leaving them in dugouts. It seemed Varvara was fortunate in her husband. The first months of marriage passed in settling into the new house on Bolshaya Alexeyevskaya. Varvara threw herself into domestic concerns, trying not to think about the fact that her husband remained a stranger. Abram was attentive but cold. He treated his wife like a precious object to be maintained and kept in order. Dinner conversations touched only on household matters. Feelings were never discussed. It was a house where polite estrangement reigned. A year after the wedding, their first son, Ivan, was born. Then came Arseny, Mikhail, and daughter Maria. Varvara devoted herself entirely to the children, insisting on hiring the best tutors, creating a home library, equipping study rooms. Abram did not object. He was satisfied that his wife dutifully produced heirs and did not interfere in his business. But it was precisely during these years of outward prosperity that the first signs of approaching catastrophe appeared. Varvara began noticing oddities in her husband's behavior. Abram could sit for hours in his study, staring at a single point. Then he would suddenly leap up and pace the room, shouting incoherent phrases about conspiracies and persecution. He claimed competitors wanted to ruin him, that workers were planning a revolt, that even the household servants had been bribed by enemies. Fits of paranoia alternated with periods of apathy when Morozov could not force himself out of bed to go to the factory. At first, Varvara attributed everything to overwork. Managing an enormous enterprise did require colossal effort, but over time the episodes grew more frequent and severe. Abram began seeing hallucinations. He claimed that at night the dead came to his room and threatened divine punishment for his sins. Once he ran into the street in his underclothes, screaming that the house was on fire when there was no fire at all. Rumors of Morozov's strangeness began spreading through Moscow. Varvara found herself trapped. On one hand, she had to conceal her husband's illness from business partners and relatives. Any rumors of the family head's madness could crash the stock of Morozov enterprises and lead to financial catastrophe. On the other hand, Abram needed medical help that could not be provided in secret. She summoned Moscow's best doctors, but they could only throw up their hands. The diagnosis sounded like a death sentence: progressive paralysis, an incurable brain disease, likely the late stage of syphilis, though this was never spoken aloud. It was then that Varvara first took management into her own hands. She started small, checking the accounts her sick husband signed, meeting with managers, delving into production questions. It turned out that years of observing her father had not been wasted. She intuitively understood the mechanisms of managing a large business. Moreover, she discovered in herself a talent for precise calculation and strategic planning. The situation became critical. Abram could no longer appear in public. He was placed in a separate wing of the house under constant care of nurses. But formally, he remained head of the family and owner of the factories. Varvara acted in his name, forging his signature on documents, conducting negotiations through trusted intermediaries. It was an extremely dangerous game. If the truth came out, competitors would immediately exploit the situation. For 5 years, Varvara led this double life. By day, she was the model merchant's wife, receiving guests, organizing charity evenings, raising children. By night, she pored over account books, studied production technologies, and mastered the intricacies of the international cotton trade. She was preparing for the moment when she would have to officially take power. And that moment was inexorably approaching. In the winter of 1882, Abram's condition deteriorated sharply. He no longer recognized his wife and children, taking them for demons come to claim his soul. The doctors warned that the end was near. Varvara summoned a notary. During a rare moment of lucidity, Abram was able to understand the essence of the document. It was then that he set that fateful condition, forbidding remarriage. Even dying, even losing his mind, he thought about preserving the family business. Or perhaps it was a final attempt to maintain control over the wife who had become stronger than he. January 1885 brought alarming news from Orekhovo-Zuyevo, an industrial town east of Moscow. At the Nikolskaya manufactory belonging to another branch of the Morozov family, a strike had erupted. 7,000 workers abandoned their looms and took to the streets, demanding higher wages and better working conditions. Authorities were moving troops toward the factory settlement. The air smelled of blood. Although this factory formerly belonged to Timofey Savich Morozov, a cousin of the late Abram, Varvara understood the fire could spread to her enterprise at any moment. The Morozov strike of 1885 became the first mass workers' action in Russian history, a landmark event that would later be celebrated in Soviet historiography. Workers didn't simply demand money. They put forward an entire program: abolition of fines, an 8-hour workday, prohibition of child labor, free medical care. It was a challenge to the entire system on which Russian industry rested. On Varvara's Tver manufactory, over 8,000 people worked under conditions no better and no worse than everywhere else. 12-hour days, barracks housing 20 to a room, fines for the slightest infraction. The system created by the late Abram worked like a well-oiled machine for extracting profit from human labor. But now that machine was breaking down. Workers at the Tver manufactory watched events in Orekhovo-Zuyevo closely. Secret meetings gathered in factory yards. Agitators called on them to support their comrades. Varvara faced an agonizing choice. The old managers, holdovers from her husband's time, demanded harsh measures: call in the Cossacks, arrest the ringleaders, fire all the discontented, and recruit new workers from the villages. That was how every factory owner of the era operated. But Varvara understood. Times had changed. What worked 20 years ago would not work now. Workers had become more literate, more organized, angrier. Crushing a strike by force meant sowing the seeds of future, even more terrible upheavals. The decision Varvara Morozova made shocked Russia's entire industrial elite. Instead of calling in troops, she ordered that workers' representatives be gathered for negotiations. She personally traveled to the factory in Tver, an unheard of act for a woman of her position. In a vast factory hall, among silent looms, she met with the workers' delegation. A 37-year-old woman in a black dress stood before a crowd of embittered men ready to turn violent at any moment. The speech Varvara Morozova delivered entered the history of the Russian labor movement. She neither threatened nor groveled. She spoke the language of numbers and facts, explained what it cost to maintain the factory, what competition with English textiles looked like, why it was impossible to double wages overnight. But she also acknowledged the justice of many workers' demands and proposed a program of gradual reforms: construction of new barracks with family rooms, opening of a factory hospital, a school for workers' children, abolition of the harshest fines. The old managers were horrified. They insisted these concessions would bankrupt the enterprise. But Varvara saw further. She understood that investments in social infrastructure would pay for themselves many times over. A satisfied worker works better than an embittered one. A literate worker masters complex machinery faster than an illiterate one. A healthy worker misses fewer shifts than a sick one. This was not charity, and it was cold calculation wearing a human face. The reform program began immediately. Within 2 years, the Tver factory gained a hospital with 100 beds, a maternity ward, a school for 300 students, and new barracks with separate rooms for families. Varvara personally oversaw every stage of construction. She demanded the hospital have the best doctors, the school have professional teachers rather than retired soldiers, as was customary. All this cost enormous sums, but the results exceeded expectations. Labor productivity at the Morozov factories rose by 30%. Worker turnover virtually ceased. The best craftsmen from across Russia sought employment specifically with Morozova. Product quality improved so dramatically that Morozov calicos began displacing English goods even in St. Petersburg. Competitors gnashed their teeth but were forced to admit Varvara Morozova's method worked. Yet this success had a darker side. The conservative wing of Moscow's merchant class began openly expressing displeasure. A woman who ran a business better than men, who made concessions to workers, who built schools instead of staying home, this was a challenge to the entire traditional order. Anonymous denunciations began pouring into the police. She was accused of sympathizing with revolutionaries, of undermining the foundations of society, even of immorality. But she held trump cards that even her fiercest opponents could not overcome: money and connections. Morozov millions opened the doors of any office, and the success of her enterprises was the best defense against attack. In 1886, a meeting occurred that overturned all of Varvara Morozova's ideas about duty and happiness. At a session of the Moscow Society of Naturalists, she met Professor Vasily Andreevich Sobolevsky, a 40-year-old scientist and editor of the liberal newspaper Ruski Vedomosti, Russian Gazette, a man of brilliant intellect and European education. Their eyes met across a hall full of bearded professors, and in that moment something irreversibly changed in the measured life of the Iron Widow. Sobolevsky was the complete opposite of the merchant world in which Varvara moved. Slender, with fine features, always impeccably dressed in the latest European fashion, he looked more like a French diplomat than a Russian professor. His passion was not profit but science and public service. He lectured at Moscow University, wrote articles about the necessity of reform, and gathered the cream of Moscow's intelligentsia at his apartment on the Arbat. And he was a bachelor, which at his age was considered almost indecent. At first, only business connected them. Varvara began financing Ruski Vedomosti, the most influential liberal newspaper in the empire. Formerly, this was ordinary patronage, But meetings about newspaper affairs grew more frequent and longer. They discussed not only finances but politics, literature, the latest scientific discoveries. For the first time in her life, Varvara had met a man who saw in her not simply a wealthy widow or a successful businesswoman, but an equal, a personality worthy of respect. By autumn 1887, it was clear that a feeling had arisen between them that could not be ignored. But the path to happiness was firmly blocked by the late Abram's will. To marry Sobolevsky meant losing everything: factories, capital, the ability to help thousands of people. Varvara was trapped between duty to her children from her first marriage, to whom she owed the preservation of their inheritance, and the right to personal happiness she had been denied in youth. The decision the lovers made was scandalous for the time. They began living as husband and wife without official registration. In conservative Moscow of the late 19th century, this was unthinkable. A woman of high society, living in sin, automatically became a pariah. But Varvara and Vasily created an elaborate system of concealment that allowed them to be together while maintaining the appearance of propriety. Officially, Varvara continued living in the mansion on Bolshaya Alexeyevskaya as a model widow. Sobolevsky rented an apartment nearby on Spiridonovka Street. Their meetings were disguised as business visits or charitable events. Only the tightest circle of trusted people knew the truth. Servants were bribed and intimidated. Managers received the strictest orders to remain silent. Any leak of information would mean catastrophe, not only for Varvara but for the thousands of people who depended on her philanthropy. In 1890, an event threatened to bring down this carefully constructed edifice. Varvara became pregnant. At 42, after 8 years of widowhood, she was expecting a child by a man who officially was nothing to her. Concealing the pregnancy from Moscow society was nearly impossible. Varvara left for Europe for several months under the pretext of medical treatment. There, in a quiet Swiss clinic, a son was born whom they named Yuri. The child was registered under his father's surname, Sobolevsky. But under the laws of the Russian Empire, children born out of wedlock had no inheritance rights whatsoever. Later, 2 more children were born, Elena and Andrei. All bore their father's surname and legally had no connection to the Morozov millions. The double life required incredible stamina. By day, she was the iron businesswoman managing an industrial empire, a philanthropist, a patron of the arts. In the evening, she hurried to Spiridonovka, where her beloved man and the children she could not publicly acknowledge awaited her. The older children from her first marriage knew about their half-siblings, but pretended they did not exist. It was a conspiracy of silence involving dozens of people. Moscow society, of course, suspected the connection between Morozova and Sobolevsky. They whispered in salons, gossiped at balls, wrote anonymous letters to the police, but there was no proof. Varvara had protected her secret too well. Besides, her influence and wealth were so great that few dared openly level accusations. She financed hospitals, universities, libraries. She employed thousands. Moscow needed her more than she needed Moscow. In 1894, Varvara decided to immortalize the family name in stone and marble. On the corner of Vozdvijenka Street and Bolshoi Kislovsky Lane, construction began on a mansion destined to become one of the most luxurious private homes in the Russian Empire. Architect Roman Ivanovich Klein a young talent just returned from Italy, received carte blanche and an unlimited budget. Varvara wanted not merely a house, she was building a temple of art, an intellectual center for the new Moscow, a place where history would be made. Construction lasted 3 years and cost the astronomical sum of over 1 million rubles, enough to build an entire factory town with a church, school, and hospital. But Varvara understood. In the world of high politics and culture, one must speak the language of luxury. Her mansion had to outshine the palaces of St. Petersburg's aristocracy to demonstrate that Moscow's merchant class yielded to the nobility in neither wealth nor taste. Klein created a masterpiece of eclecticism, combining elements of the Italian Renaissance, French Classicism, and Russian Art Nouveau. The facade was adorned with columns of Carrara marble, shipped specially from Italy. The interiors staggered the imagination: a white hall with Venetian mirrors, a red drawing room in the style of Louis XV, a Gothic study with stained glass by the great artist Mikhail Vrubel. Every room was a work of art crafted by Europe's finest masters, but the house's greatest treasure was its library, 20,000 volumes collected from around the world. First editions of Pushkin and Gogol, 15th century incunabula, manuscripts of ancient Russian chronicles. Varvara personally selected every book. For her, books were not merely collectibles, but instruments for transforming society. She believed that enlightenment could change Russia better than any revolution. The housewarming in December 1897 became the talk of all Moscow. Varvara invited the cream of society: industrialists and professors, artists and writers, liberal politicians, and even several Grand Dukes. It was a manifesto of a new era where money and culture walked hand in hand, where merchant capital supported intellectual progress. From that moment, the Morozova mansion became Moscow's most influential salon. Every Thursday, the people who defined Russia's intellectual life gathered there. Anton Chekhov read newly written stories. Leo Tolstoy debated the paths to Russia's salvation with philosopher Vladimir Solovyov. The young Alexander Blok declaimed poetry. Konstantin Stanislavski discussed plans for creating a new theater, what would become the legendary Moscow Art Theater. Ideas were born here that would transform Russian culture for generations. Varvara conducted this intellectual orchestra with the skill of an experienced maestro. She knew how to connect the unconnectable, to seat people of opposing views at the same table, to create an atmosphere in which great projects were born. Yet she herself mostly listened in silence, absorbing ideas that she would later bring to life with her millions. Many guests never suspected that their scientific research or artistic projects were secretly financed by their hostess. The salon also served as a hub for supporting the liberal press. Varvara didn't simply give money to newspapers and journals. She created an entire media empire opposing official propaganda. Ruski Vedomosti, edited by Vasily Sobolevsky, received an annual subsidy of 100,000 rubles from her. The journal Russkaya Misl, Russian Thought, existed exclusively on Morozov money. The authorities watched the Morozov salon with suspicion. Police archives preserve reports from secret agents planted among the servants, meticulously recording every word, every meeting, every guest. The Department of Police considered Varvara Morozova one of the most dangerous women in the empire, but arresting her was impossible. Her influence was too great, too many depended on her money, and she was too careful in her actions. The paradox was that Varvara Morozova was not a revolutionary in any direct sense. She did not want to destroy the existing order. She dreamed of its gradual transformation through enlightenment and culture. Her ideal was a constitutional monarchy on the English model, where capital and intelligentsia work together for the common good. But history does not tolerate half measures. The forces she supported with her money would ultimately sweep away the world of which she was a part. In autumn 1885, Varvara stood on a vacant lot near the Sretensky gates looking at piles of construction debris. Here, on the site of demolished hovels, Moscow's first free public library would rise, not merely a reading room for the educated, but a true temple of knowledge open to all, from professor to factory worker. The idea seemed utopian. Conservative merchants tapped their temples. Why teach the common people to read? Officials saw it as subversion. A literate populace is dangerous to authority. But Varvara Morozova had made her decision, and when she decided something, stopping her was impossible. The Turgenev Reading Room, named for the recently deceased novelist Ivan Turgenev, opened in January 1886. It was a revolutionary institution for Russia. For the first time in the country's history, a library operated without class restrictions. No loyalty documents were required, no membership fees, no letters of recommendation. Any person could walk in, take a book, and read for free. It was so unusual that the first visitors didn't believe it. They looked for the catch, waited to be asked for money. Varvara invested 200,000 rubles of personal funds in creating the library. But it wasn't only about money. She personally compiled the catalog, selected books, and ensured the collection reflected all directions of human thought. Russian and foreign classics, scientific works, textbooks, even editions banned by censorship kept in a special section for researchers. By the end of its first year, the library held 30,000 volumes. The reading hall with 200 seats was perpetually overcrowded. Students prepared for exams, workers studied technical innovations, townspeople read novels. The library became a place where class boundaries dissolved, where a count might sit at the same table as a shop clerk, a professor beside a factory hand. It was a small model of the society Varvara Morozova dreamed of, but the Turgenev Reading Room was only the beginning. In 1905, Varvara learned of a project by General Alphonse Leonovich Chanyavsky, who had bequeathed his fortune to create a people's university. The idea was magnificent, but Chanyavsky's money wasn't enough even to purchase a building. Varvara immediately joined the project, contributing 500,000 rubles and taking on the organizational work. The Moscow City People's University, named after Chanyavsky, opened in 1908 and became a sensation. It was the first institution of higher education in Russia that admitted students regardless of gender, religion, or social origin. No gymnasium diploma was required, no knowledge of ancient languages, only a desire to learn and basic literacy. The best professors in Moscow lectured there, many working for free as a civic duty. Varvara sat on the university's board of trustees and effectively determined its policies. She insisted that education be maximally accessible. Symbolic tuition of just 10 rubles per semester, with scholarships for the poor. The university was meant not merely to impart knowledge, but to form a new Russian intelligentsia. educated, active, free from class prejudice. Parallel to her educational projects, Varvara pursued medical philanthropy. In 1903, she allocated 1 million rubles for construction of a cancer institute on Divichy Pole, the first specialized oncology center in Russia, equipped with the latest in science, X-ray machines from Germany, a radium laboratory modeled on the Curie Institute in Paris, operating rooms with electric lighting. She demanded the treatment be accessible not only to the wealthy, but to poor patients as well. Varvara Morozova's methods in philanthropy were revolutionary for her time. She did not distribute alms or build poor houses. She created institutions meant to change society. She considered education and healthcare the primary instruments of social progress. A literate and healthy people will find their own path to prosperity. One need only give them the opportunity. The total sum Varvara Morozova spent on philanthropy over 30 years exceeded 5 million rubles, money that could have ensured a comfortable life for dozens of generations of her descendants. But she thought differently. Wealth not directed toward the public good is a curse, not a blessing. Capital must work for progress. Otherwise, it becomes dead weight, dragging society backward. Varvara sat in her study on Vozdvijenka and looked at 3 portraits hanging opposite her desk. Her 3 sons from her first marriage, Ivan, Mikhail, and Arseny, 3 completely different men united only by their surname and their right to a 1 million ruble inheritance. She had given them the best education money could buy, opened doors to high society, secured their futures, but each chose his own path, paths leading ever further from what she had sacrificed her personal happiness to preserve. The eldest, Ivan Abramovich, born in 1871, inherited from his grandfather Kludov a passion for collecting. But while the grandfather collected ancient manuscripts, Ivan was interested only in modern art. At 25, he first visited Paris and was consumed. Impressionists, post-impressionists, fauvists. He bought paintings with manic obsession. Monet, Renoir, Cézanne, Gauguin, Matisse, Picasso. In 10 years, he assembled one of the world's finest collections of modern French painting. Varvara initially supported her son's passion. Art is wonderful, it's culture, the middle enlightenment, Mikhail, but gradually collecting became took an entirely different path. Ivan spent millions on paintings, abandoned he was marked from childhood by a painful sensitivity and a tendency toward melancholy. After graduating from the History and Philology faculty of Moscow University, he immersed himself in English literature. His idol was Oscar Wilde. His Bible was aestheticism. Mika dressed like a London dandy, spoke with an English accent even when speaking Russian, and surrounded himself with exquisite objects and beautiful young men of dubious reputation. Moscow society whispered about Mikhail Morozov's eccentricities, his nocturnal revels in the company of actors and artists, his scandalous liaisons that he did not even attempt to conceal. Varvara suffered watching her son become a laughingstock in the eyes of respectable society. But what could she do? Mika was of age, had his own money, and lived his own life. The only concession she managed to extract was his agreement to be formally listed as director of one of the factories, though he appeared at the plant perhaps once a year. But the true tragedy was the youngest son, Arseny, born in 1877. Unlike his aesthete brothers, he was drawn from youth to social questions. While studying at the law faculty, he joined student circles, read Marx, and debated the fate of the proletariat. Varvara initially paid little attention. What young man doesn't flirt with radical ideas? But after the upheaval of 1905, Russia's first revolution, a dress rehearsal for what was to come, Arseny committed himself fully to the revolutionary path. The bitter irony was that Arseny Morozov financed the Bolsheviks with money earned from the exploitation of the very workers whose liberation he championed. He funneled large sums into the party treasury, hid illegal literature in the family mansions, and sheltered revolutionaries fleeing the police. Varvara learned of this from her informants within the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police. Yes, she had connections there too. The scandal could have destroyed the entire family. The son of one of Russia's wealthiest women, a sponsor of the revolutionary underground. Varvara tried to talk to Arseny, but the conversation turned into a bitter confrontation. Her son accused her of hypocrisy. You build libraries and hospitals to soothe your conscience, but the system remains unchanged. The workers are still slaves, and we are still slave owners. Varvara replied that revolution would bring only blood and chaos, that change must come gradually through enlightenment and reform. They shouted at each other like strangers, and finally Arseny slammed the door, declaring he had no need of his mother's money. But the most terrible part was that he continued receiving his share of factory profits. Under Abram Morozov's will, the sons were entitled to a fixed percentage of earnings, and Varvara had no legal power to withhold it. Thus, Morozov millions flowed into the Bolshevik party treasury, financing the newspaper Iskra, the Spark, and funding underground printing presses. Varvara knew and could do nothing. To stop her son would mean handing him over to the police. And a mother's heart was incapable of that. By 1910, it was clear that none of her sons would continue the family enterprise. Ivan lived in his invented world of art. Mikhail was burning through life in decadent pleasures. Arseny was preparing a revolution that would destroy everything his mother had built. Varvara recognized with bitterness that her sacrifice had been in vain. She had preserved the Morozov Empire, but there was no one to pass it to. The money that was meant to ensure the family's greatness had become a curse, corrupting some children and pushing others toward destruction. A December morning, 1905, Varvara Morozova stands at the window of her mansion on Vozdvizhenka and looks out at barricades that sprang up overnight directly opposite her house. Workers from the Presnya district, the very people she had treated in her hospitals and educated in her schools, are tearing up cobblestones to build revolutionary fortifications. On the corner of Bolshoi Kislovsky Lane stands a machine gun. Young men with red armbands check the documents of passers-by. Moscow has risen in revolt, and the front line runs straight through the city's most elegant neighborhood. Her estate manager begged Varvara to leave while there was still time. Artillery bombardment could begin at any moment. Government troops would show no mercy to the insurgents. But she refused to go. More than that, when students fleeing a Cossack raid knocked on her door that night, Varvara ordered them admitted and hidden in the cellars. The manager was horrified. Harboring revolutionaries could cost not only her fortune, but her life. Varvara answered briefly, "I do not hand people over to be slaughtered, whoever they may be." For 3 days, the Morozova mansion served as a secret refuge for wounded insurgents. Her personal physician provided medical care. The kitchen prepared food that was smuggled to the defenders of the barricades. It was an absurd situation. A capitalist, an owner of factories and mills, helping those who wanted to destroy capitalism. But for Varvara, this was not a question of politics. It was a question of humanity. She saw not revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries, but young people who might die. When the Semyonovsky regiment, an elite guards unit brought in from St. Petersburg, crushed the uprising and arrests began, Varvara used every ounce of her influence to save those who could still be saved. Her money opened prison doors. Her connections helped secure reduced sentences. She made no distinctions among those she rescued, socialist revolutionaries, social democrats, or simply bystanders caught in the crossfire. The police knew of her activities but chose to look the other way. Too many people in high places owed Varvara Morozova some money, some favors. After the suppression of the revolt, life seemed to return to its former course. But Varvara understood this was only a reprieve. The old world was coming apart at the seams. On her factories, discontent was brewing again. Despite all her social programs, workers demanded more. An 8-hour day, the right to strike, participation in management. What had seemed unthinkable yesterday was becoming a subject of discussion today. Varvara made concessions, but she understood there was a line she could not cross while remaining the owner of factories. The year 1914 brought a new trial, war with Germany. Varvara immediately threw herself into supporting the front. Half her factory's production capacity was redirected to manufacturing army cloth and bandaging materials. In the mansion on Vozvijenka, she opened a hospital for wounded officers. At 66, she personally worked shifts in the wards, assisted doctors, and comforted the dying, laboring like an ordinary nurse, sparing herself nothing. But her greatest wartime project was organizing hospital trains. With her personal funds, Varvara equipped 5 rail convoys, transforming ordinary carriages into mobile hospitals, operating theaters fitted with the latest medical technology, wards for the critically wounded, pharmacies, even small laboratories. These trains shuttled between the front and rear hospitals, saving thousands of lives. Varvara herself traveled to the front lines several times to inspect their operation. The war laid bare every wound in Russian society. Corruption, theft, and the incompetence of authorities led to catastrophe at the front and disintegration in the rear. Varvara watched the empire she had served her entire life crumble. Her own family was falling apart before her eyes. Ivan had left for Paris with no intention of returning to a Russia at war. Mikhail had retreated into a morphine haze, escaping reality. Arseny openly declared that defeat in the war would hasten revolution. February 1917 found Varvara in Moscow. She received the news of the Tsar's abdication calmly, without surprise. The provisional government inspired hope for sensible reforms, for Russia's transformation into a modern democratic state. Varvara even felt her spirits lift. She began planning expansions of her educational projects. It seemed that at last the time had come when her ideas of enlightenment and social progress would find support from those in power. But by summer, it was clear the country was hurtling toward the abyss. The provisional government was powerless. The army was disintegrating. Factories were shutting down. At the Morozov mills, workers had formed their own committees and effectively removed the administration from management. Varvara tried to negotiate, made every possible concession, but she felt it. The time for compromise had passed. The Russia she had known and worked for was dying. In its place came a new world, brutal and incomprehensible, where there was no room for people like her. September 4th, 1917. The mansion on Vozdvizenka is quiet. Too quiet for a house where life had so recently bustled, where all the intellectual luminaries of Moscow had gathered. Varvara Morozova lies in her bedroom on the second floor. She's 69 and strength is leaving her with every passing hour. Beside the bed sits Vasily Sobolevsky, her secret husband, the man she had loved for 30 years and with whom she was never able to officially unite her fate. He holds her hand and understands. This is the end. Outside the windows, revolutionary Moscow seethes. Rallies fill the streets. The air is thick with premonition of great upheaval. In just over a month, the Bolsheviks will seize power and an entirely different story will begin. But Varvara Morozova will not see it. Fate was merciful, allowing her to depart before everything she had built over decades came crashing down. She will not see Redgar seal her mansion, nationalize her factories, or watch her children flee the country or bend to the new regime. In her final days, Varvara thought often about the path she had traveled, from an 18-year-old girl married off to a near stranger, to one of the most influential women in the Russian Empire. She had managed an industrial empire worth tens of millions of rubles, employed tens of thousands, built libraries, universities, hospitals. She had changed countless lives by giving people the chance to learn, to heal, to grow. But was it enough? Did it justify the sacrifices she had made? She thought of her children, of the elder sons who never became stewards of the family enterprise. Ivan, with his art collection, soon to be nationalized by the Soviet state. Mikhail, lost in decadent dreams and morphine. Arseny, who had financed the very Bolsheviks who would destroy his mother's world. And the younger children by Sobolevsky, who had grown up in the shadow of another surname, denied the right to openly call her mother. All of them were victims of the choice she had made 35 years earlier, accepting the terms of her husband's will. But had she any other option? Could she have refused to manage the factories, married the man she loved, lived a simple woman's life? In theory, yes. In practice, it would have meant betraying thousands of people who depended on the Morozov enterprises. It would have meant abandoning the chance to change the world for the better, slowly, gradually, but to change it nonetheless. Varvara chose duty, and that choice defined her entire life. Remarkably, as she lay dying, Varvara felt no bitterness. Yes, many of her hopes had not been realized. Enlightenment had not saved Russia from revolution. Social reforms had not prevented class hatred. Her children had not become the people she wished them to be. But can a life be considered wasted if you gave education to thousands? If the hospitals you built saved countless lives? If the institutions you created continue to function even after your death, even under different names? The Turgenev Library would survive the revolution and become the foundation for Soviet public libraries. The Shanyavsky People's University, after many transformations, would become the Russian State University for the Humanities. The Cancer Institute on the Vichy Pole would continue saving lives under a new name. Even the Morozov factories, nationalized and renamed, would operate for decades more. Varvara Morozova was departing, but her life's work remained. On her last day, a priest came, an old believer clergyman who had known her since childhood. Varvara confessed, took communion, and asked forgiveness of all whom she had knowingly or unknowingly wronged. Then she asked that all her children be summoned. Only those who were in Moscow came. She blessed each one, making no distinction between legitimate and illegitimate. Varvara Morozova's last words were addressed to Vasily Sobolevsky. Thank you for 30 years of happiness. She died quietly, without suffering, as though she had simply fallen asleep. The funeral was modest. The time for grand ceremonies had passed. Several hundred people gathered at the Preobrazhensky cemetery. Workers from the Morozov factories, students from the People's University, readers from the Turgenev Library, patients healed in her hospitals. They came to bid farewell to a woman who had tried to change Russia, not through revolution but evolution, not through violence but enlightenment. History does not deal in the subjunctive, but it is impossible not to wonder what might have been if Russia had produced more people like Varvara Morozova. If enlightened capitalists had managed to modernize the country before the revolutionary wave engulfed it, if the path of reform had proven stronger than the path of revolution, we will never know the answer, but we can remember the woman who tried to build a bridge between old Russia and new, a bridge that collapsed along with the empire. Today, in Moscow, the mansion on Vozvizenka still stands. It now serves as the Russian government's reception house. The building of the People's University survives on Myuskaya Square. The former Cancer Institute, now a National Oncology Research Center, continues its work. But few remember the woman who made it all possible. Varvara Morozova remains in the shadow of her more famous relatives, in the shadow of an era that spared no one. Yet her story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are people willing to sacrifice the personal for the common good, to build rather than destroy, to enlighten rather than deceive. And as long as such people exist, humanity retains hope.